The Philadelphia Church of God presents the Trumpet Daily.
May 5th in 2001 is when my father first announced that the world had entered into the last hour before Jesus Christ returned to this earth. And as I think all of us are very well aware, 4 months after he made that statement, the United States was attacked on September the 11th, and it was the worst terrorist attack ever carried out on U.S. soil. Now, as my father points out in his book that he later wrote based upon that message from May 5th, 2001, called The Last Hour, God allowed that attack on 9/11 to signal to America, and as well as to the rest of this world, that we were in fact in the last hour leading up to the return of Christ. It was a sign, actually, of just how close we are to the prophesied return of Christ and the establishment of God's kingdom to be set up on this earth. Let's begin in 1 John 2 and see the scripture in particular that he referred to that mentions the last hour. 1 John chapter 2 and verse 15. John, as I think most of you know, was referred to in the Bible as the disciple that Jesus Christ loved. He had a very special relationship with Jesus, spent much more time with Christ than the other disciples did, and this special relationship gave him a deeper understanding of certain subjects that are talked about in his writings. If you look at John's writings, you can see quite a few terms and phrases that just aren't found in other books of the Bible. So he really does give to us a unique perspective. 1 John 2 and verse 15, it says, "Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him." Don't love this world. And listen, if your eyes are opening to what's happening in this world, and many eyes are not, many of them are asleep, totally asleep. So they don't see what's happening in this world. But if we see, and then added to that, if we're digging into the Bible, if our minds are absorbing the truth of God, then we should be drifting farther and farther away from this world, not from God, but from this world and the things of this world. Of course, even to use the word drift isn't necessarily the best word, because it's not a drift, is it? It's a drift in the other direction. But we have to choose a course, and we have to stay on that path and get up if we slip up once in a while. Verse 16 says, "For all that is in this world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world." It is Satan's world, isn't it? As Paul said to the Corinthians. And Satan has deceived this world, as John wrote in the book of Revelation. Verse 17, "And the world passes away, and the lust thereof, but he that does the will of God abides forever." See, this really is what true education is all about. I mean, we're here to live a way of life that will abide, that won't pass away like this world or like this age is about to just pass away. We're not only here to live it, to use it, but also eventually to teach it to this world that needs this hope that God provides. Verse 18, it says, "Little children, it is the last time," or as it should read, "it is the last hour." You can look at that yourself in the Revised Standard Version. "Little children, it is the last hour. And as you have heard, that Antichrist shall come. Even now are there many Antichrists," those fighting against Christ, in other words, "whereby we know that it is the last hour." Here's a quote from my father's book. This is right at the front on page 2. the Last Hour book, he says, we may be witnessing the worst hour ever in God's work. From now on, we are in the last hour, a time like no other. We will experience the worst turmoil and violence ever on earth. That's what this last hour is all about. And within months of my father's first message on this subject, as I said, we watched live, many of us, live. School was just starting for Armstrong College. And as we interrupted classes to watch this play out on TV screens, a live transmission of the worst terrorist attack ever on U.S. soil. Look at what's happened since that time. I mean, that event in itself, seeing those two buildings come down 10 years ago, was a signal in and of itself. But look at what's happened since 9/11. Look at how fast prophetic events have been moving forward over the last 10 years. Let's look at Leviticus 26. We've written so much about these events at thetrumpet.com, but you're seeing all of the major blocks that the Bible speaks of prophetically. You're seeing them emerge onto the scene, or in the case of the descendants of Israel, you're seeing them fade from the scene. All of it, though, all of it, according to Bible prophecy. As Mr. Armstrong wrote decades and decades ago in the United States and Britain in prophecy, so much of what we write about at thetrumpet.com is based on that book, The U.S. and Britain in Prophecy, first written back in the 1940s, was it? Maybe the 30s. I can't remember exactly. But 60, 70 years ago, right when the British Empire was coming off of its peak, and right when the United States was ascending to become the world power, the world superpower, the global policeman, and here was Mr. Armstrong writing this book based upon the prophecies of God, prophecies that many, even in his own church, scoffed. Leviticus 26 and verse 14, it says, "But if you will not hearken unto me, and will not do all these commandments, and if you shall despise my statutes, or if your soul abhor my judgments, so that you will not do all my commandments, but that you break my covenant, I also will do this unto you. I will even appoint over you terrorism, it says, consumption, and the burning ague, it says, that shall consume the eyes and cause sorrow of heart. And you shall sow your seed in vain, for your enemies shall eat it." See the chapter about the blessings and the cursings. It's not fashionable, of course, to talk about cursings, particularly when coming from God. Everyone that brings that up is immediately scolded by a leftist media complex that doesn't want to hear anything about God or God having to do with the affairs of this world. And yet God has everything to do with what's happening in this world. He's either causing events or allowing them to happen because Satan is the god of this world. But he's not going to be there for much longer. God is taking action even now to solve the problems of this world. He's not paralyzed with inaction like so many of our leaders are today. He is moving forward with his plan. Verse 17 says, "And I will set my face against you, and you shall be slain before your enemies. They that hate you shall reign over you, and you shall flee when none pursue." He says, "And if you will not yet for all this hearken unto me, then I will punish you 7 times more for your sins." Let me read to you what it says in the United States and Britain in prophecy. This is Mr. Armstrong writing. He says, "But after God had withheld the birthright 2,520 years," this is speaking of the promises now, the birthright promises that God had made to Abraham. And if you haven't read the U.S. and Britain in prophecy, you've got to request it or go get it and study into what God promised and why those promises were withheld for 2,520 years and what happened when that time period was ended and what is happening now today in these latter days. It's all in that book, all of it. He says, when our peoples deserved nothing from God, this is after the 2520 had ended, he says, Mr. Armstrong writes, He, God, suddenly bestowed on us national blessings unparalleled in history. The unconditional promise to Abraham was kept. No longer is God obligated by his promise to continue our undeserving peoples in world prestige, wealth, and greatness. Once we had been given such unrivaled position, it was up to us whether we should keep it. See, we were gifted with these blessings, and after God gave them to us, then his obligation to distribute those blessings because of the promises, the unconditional promises he made to Abraham, his obligation was over. And then, as Mr. Armstrong says there, it was up to us as to what we would do with those blessings. And look at how we've squandered them away. Look at how they've slipped away. There was a time, of course, with the British Empire, for example, that, as Mr. Armstrong says, the sun never set on this empire, in control of about 3/4 of the world's wealth. I mean, just look at the English-speaking nations today and see how dominant that empire was, not just militarily, not just economically, but culturally, in every way. The British Empire, and yet look at how dramatically things changed for Britain after 2 difficult world wars, after going into debt coming out of World War II. It was a relatively smooth transition, because it went from a British-dominated world to an American-dominated world. And if you know anything about the British people and the American people, there's some pretty close ties there, right? You know that from U.S. history, but we also know that from biblical history. We come from the same family. And so there wasn't this great disruption when U.S. hegemony replaced British power, British leadership. It was actually one of the smoothest transfers of global dominance ever. Look at the history books and see what happens when one empire rises up to overtake another. It's generally not a pretty picture. In this case, though, it was very smooth going. But what happens when America's run is over? What happens when America's role as global superpower ends and the transfer of power shifts over to China and to Russia and to Germany? These nations that we don't have those kinds of family ties with. Do you think the transfer of power will be just as smooth as it was last time? Of course it won't be. It's not going to be a smooth sailing transfer. We're going to see a lot of upset, a lot of disruptive behavior. We know that just because of what prophecy says. Verse 19 says, "And I will break the pride of your power, and I will make your heaven as iron and your earth as brass." Let me read to you what we wrote. This is back right after 9/11. Just go back and read that November 2001 issue of the Trumpet sometime. Skim through it and see what we were saying. That was the first issue after this spectacular terrorist attack, this horrific attack. We wrote, "Does America have the will to see it through? What happens when the war spreads from Afghanistan to other less isolated governments, when world opinion begins to turn on the U.S.? See, it all started with Afghanistan. Early on in 2002, in his State of the Union address, President Bush identified Iran as one of 3 nations that were working together in this axis of evil, as he called it. Iran was behind it, as we said clearly from the start, and even as, to a large extent, President Bush recognized back at the beginning of 2002. He told Congress that the war against terrorism would not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated. Now that's what he said back then. That's what America said back then, or the position America took back then. This is what we wrote, though, based on Bible prophecy. It said in the Trumpet, "While the U.S. wants to eliminate terrorism and is becoming much more aggressive in trying to do so, its efforts will fall short. It frankly does not have the necessary will to tackle the enormity of the problem." That's based upon this passage in Leviticus 26. The broken will. It didn't have the will to face the enormity of this problem, the size of this problem, the source of this problem, which of course all went back to Iran. In that same article, we wrote this: as we now examine the facts emerging from this war, now keep in mind this was right after 9/11, we can see unequivocally that the terrorist snake will survive America's aggression, head intact and stronger than ever. That's speaking of Iran. It will survive, we said. And it will come out of this as strong as ever, stronger than ever. That's quite an accurate forecast if you know what's happening today. The other day on Fox, there was a report, this is from September 6th, about our U.S. military commanders and the level of frustration that they have over the Iranian-backed incursions into Iraq and other places throughout the Middle East. This, as I said, is from Fox. U.S. commanders and intelligence officers are pushing for greater authority to conduct covert operations to thwart Iranian influence in neighboring Iraq. They want more leeway, more freedom to go after Iran, in other words. It says the move comes amid growing concern in the Obama administration about Iran's attempts in recent months to expand its influence in Iraq and the broader Middle East. And what it says is Tehran's increased arms smuggling to its allies. See, Iran's really ramping up its efforts, spreading its influence. It's not so much covert anymore from their end, because they know we're on the way out. It's interesting, on the same day that I read that report, the very same day, Fox also reported that the U.S. was intending to draw down its forces to about 3,000 troops in Iraq. 3,000 troops by the end of this year. So even as we're pulling back, even as we're drawing down, Iran is flexing its muscle, expanding its territorial reach. It's all happening just as we said it would back in November of 2001. We wrote, there will soon come a point when the U.S. won't even be a factor in this war. Now, leaving aside Bible prophecy, that's a pretty bold statement to make, that the U.S. wouldn't even be a factor. Now, jump forward to when we started off in the project in Iraq in 2003. We wrote this: now that Iraq has been taken out of the picture, Iran is even closer to becoming the reigning king of the Middle East. It may seem shocking. This is right after we knocked out Saddam. This is right after we just flooded Iraq with all of these U.S. troops. And we wrote, it may seem shocking given the U.S. presence in the region right now, but prophecy indicates that in pursuit of its goal, Iran will probably take over Iraq. At least it will have a heavy influence over the Iraqi people. Now that has since happened. It's happened. Recently there was a TV station that broadcast the Key of David, one of our many stations that carry our program, and they asked for us to send another tape because they didn't accept the one that my father did. It was on the Middle East and what's happening in Libya and how Iran's expanding its influence. And the statement that they drew attention to, that they especially didn't like, was where it said that my father talks about how that the U.S. policies have helped. They've helped terrorism to spread. They've helped Iran to gain strength. He said, in particular, I would submit to you that the United States has helped Iran develop their terrorist network more than any nation on this earth, and I think that's to our shame. That's what my father said, and one station didn't want to hear it. They wanted another program submitted. But look, just because we don't want to hear it doesn't mean it isn't true. It is true, and it's happening. This is from Stratfor on September the 8th. Iran has been the single biggest beneficiary of the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq. That's Stratfor this year, this month. Iran has seen a rapid rise in the magnitude of its regional influence and has every intention of keeping it. That's why we see them flexing their muscles, you see. America came in there just as we said, and look, maybe the station thought it was a politically motivated statement, but it has nothing to do with whether it's the Obama administration or with what the Bush administration did. In both cases, we've helped clear out the natural enemies that were there to counter the strength of Iran. It happened in Iraq, and now here more recently it's happened with Egypt, Libya, Say what you will about some of these dictators, they did provide some resistance to the king of the south. They're gone now. Verse 20, here in Leviticus, it says, "And your strength shall be spent in vain, for your land shall not yield her increase, neither shall the trees of the land yield their fruits." See, the strength of the latter-day Israelites, those descendants of Israel, the strength, there's some strength there, but as the Bible says, it would be spent in vain. What do we have to show for it after 10 years of fighting against terrorism? As I said, we've handed Iraq over to Iran on a silver platter. Afghanistan will be next. Egypt's in the process of moving over in that direction. Libya will follow. Ethiopia, as you've heard on the Key of David. And a lot of this in large part because of the United States. The United States policies to get Mubarak out, to get Gaddafi out, to get Saddam out, to clear out Iraq and then to hand it over. What do we have to show for it? Well, it's interesting that God uses the word spent there, doesn't it? I mean, in verse 20, your strength shall be spent in vain. The U.S. national debt at the time of 9/11 was $5.7 trillion. Now, that's not exactly pennies. That's a big debt. 5.7 trillion. But what have we spent in the 10 years since? An additional 9 trillion. Now it's pushing $15 trillion, our national debt. That's not to say all of this has gone toward the war efforts. It's just to say that we're on an unsustainable path. We can't keep spending money on wars and these ever-expanding social programs at home. The problem with the British Empire coming out of World War II started with money. They went broke, and then the nation, the empire, fell apart, and that's where it's starting with the United States. Just as we've been saying all along, this again from that November 2001 Trumpet, Mr. Tim Thompson wrote, this was not too long before he died. He used to stay right on top of this subject. This from November 2001. Even before the attacks, the world was already in dire straits economically, Mr. Thompson wrote. Europe, America, and Japan, the world's top economies, were struggling through synchronized downturn, which has not occurred since the 1930s, during the Great Depression. After September 11, the ripples emanating from the threefold simultaneous slowdown became an international economic tidal wave that now threatens to swamp or even sink the titanic global economy. He says an American economic recovery appears to be the world's only hope at this point. The massive U.S. economy represents about 1/4 of global economic output. A recovery in America is the only hope. And you look back historically and say, well, but there was the dot-com boom and then the mortgage boom and all those things. There was a recovery, right? Well, they were just all bubbles. And now the bubbles have popped. And now there's nothing artificial left to inflate it up. The housing market has popped. The dot-com boom popped. The world depends on America to buy its goods and services, and in the decade of the 1990s, America did not disappoint with its seemingly insatiable consumption. Consumer spending has also been the main girder holding up the U.S. economy. He says, finally, this magazine has been warning the world that a globe-impacting financial shock to the American economy was coming. We just didn't know exactly how or when. We knew this because of biblical prophecy. We knew it was coming, you see. But note, I haven't had time here to talk about really what's happening in Europe besides just a passing reference there to their economic condition, which is dire right now. But the news constantly coming out of Europe revolves around Germany. Germany's now calling the shots. That too, very, very significant prophetically. But notice what Mr. Stein writes in his book, After America. I mean, that's saying something right there just with that title. We're preparing for this. You hear statements from politicians now, not just journalists, that are accepting the fact that, our run is over. He says, faced with the choice between unsustainable entitlements and maintaining armed forces of global reach, the United States, as Europe did, will abandon military capability and toss the savings into the great sucking maw of social spending, he says. Europe was able to get away with that after the World War II, largely because of the American policemen. But now that America is turning inward, Europe is going to revive militarily. That's one point where he doesn't have it quite right. But on a lot of other things, he can see what's coming on the horizon. That in turn will make for not only a more dangerous world, but a more vulnerable America. That, to modify President Bush, will wind up having to fight them over here because we no longer have the capacity to fight them over there. In other words, it's coming here. There's not too many commentators that will even accept that reality. They just think we're America. If you're born in America, you've won the lottery. Those days, though, are over. Finally, he says, for Americans, the best-case scenario is that Washington's ruling kleptocracy sleepwalks its subjects into smaller homes, smaller cars, smaller lives, a soft despotism so beguilingly they don't notice it's over until late in the day. But listen to this. He says, a more likely prospect is a catastrophically convulsed America that descends into balkanized ruin and social collapse on a planet with no global order, in which the former hyperpower still makes the most inviting target. See, this is where most commentators stop short. They can see where we're descending, but what they don't see, what they don't want to accept, is how that makes the United States of America a most inviting target. That's what we've got to face. If we're based in reality, if we're keeping our nose in Bible prophecy, if we're preparing for what's ahead, because we can know what's coming. Mr. Armstrong laid it all out there for us in the United States and Britain in prophecy. And now we see all of this happening and accelerating so much now because we're in the last hour leading up to the return of Jesus Christ to this earth.
This is the book my father wrote following his message on May 5th, 2001, and after the events of 9/11. Call now for your free copy and we'll send you one right away. The Last Hour. It contains an urgent warning message of more than 100 pages. Really, there's no biblical expression more urgent than the last hour. 1 John 2 and verse 18 puts time right at the center of the stage. It's because we're running out of time. Things will never return to the way that they once were. From now on, we're in the last hour, a time like no other, and like you heard on today's forum, it's during this final hour that the earth will experience its worst ever turmoil. Thankfully, it all concludes with the greatest event ever to occur in the history of the universe. Call today and request this free book, The Last Hour. And when you call, you can also ask for this Trumpet Daily reprint, The Head of the Snake. This article was featured in the November 2001 Trumpet. It's nearly 10 years old, but it's as timely as ever. Get your free copy today and see how accurate God's prophetic forecast was and is. Now you can obtain both of these publications online right now at thetrumpetdaily.com. The website features all the literature offers and makes it easy for you to download what you need right now to continue your study.